Well, all right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to start by saying good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedules to be with us this morning and talk about some of these issues regarding NERC CIP. A couple quick administrative issues. If you have questions, we want to hear them. So please use the question feature in the GoToWebinar interface. Also, in order to see the full slide, you might need to transition to full screen mode. And also, we want to let you know that a copy of the presentation will be available on our website, and also will include our transcribed questions to answers to your questions, I should say. So with that, welcome again. I'd like to introduce Steve Hamburg, the president of Encari. This is Lenny Mansell, the director of consulting services. So Steve, you know, everybody in the industry is kind of focused on version 5 right now, and here we are talking about the version 3 standards. Can you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing is, I guess the best analogy I can provide is think back to when we were in grade school, and let's say you're learning a certain unit of mathematics, and you know your teacher's teaching you these new concepts and such, and before the teacher is ready to move to the next unit, the teacher wants to make sure you have enough proficiency in the unit that you're studying. So this webinar is aligned very much to that philosophy, in that you're right, Lenny, we're seeing a huge emphasis towards responsible entities focusing on version 5. But the reality is yes, it's prudent to look forward to version 5, but there's still a lot of challenges that many utilities are facing as it pertains to version 3. And there are, you know, notably a lot of differences between version 3 and version 5, but there's also a lot of overlap. There's a lot of commonality. So, you know, this webinar is focusing on, okay, we are moving to version 5 ultimately, but when we move to version 5, there's a number of things that don't change as it pertains to version 3. And we just want to highlight challenges that a lot of responsible entities have been encountering, and make sure, you know, by shedding light on these challenges, that when everybody does ultimately move towards version 5, you know, they have these version 3 related things sufficiently addressed so that these issues don't, you know, perpetuate themselves when we move to version 5. And then also, just in the context of this webinar, we are going to be talking about version 5, and I just want to emphasize that we're primarily focusing on BES cyber systems with high and medium impact ratings. As we all know, there's not a lot of protective controls currently that need to be applied to the low impact rating BES cyber systems. So just wanted to make sure everyone was cognizant of that as we move forward in the webinar.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, you know, we're talking about some gotchas here and kind of what it looks like between version 3 and version 5, and some of the things that sort of remain the same. And, you know, it's got a slide here talking about our basis. Tell us about the basis of some of these gotchas.
Yeah, so, you know, it's hard to gain insight into challenges that the industry is facing if you don't have a lot of experience being immersed, you know, in this NERC CIP compliance arena. So, you know, the basis of everything that we're going to be discussing in this webinar is derived from the experience that Encari has had in delivering a very large number of compliance gap analyses, compliance audit, compliance evaluations of NERC CIP compliance program documentation and evidence, developing NERC CIP compliance programs, shoring up any deficiencies in entities, NERC CIP compliance programs. Just basically all of this is derived from the experience that we've gleaned in providing our consulting services, but then also above and beyond that, attending SDT meetings, CIPC meetings, user group meetings, interacting with regional entities, observing what's occurring with NERC, conversations, correspondences that we have with utilities, municipals, and co-ops, applying that to, our insights, our basis for what we're going to be discussing today as well.
Yeah, great. One thing before we proceed, I wanted to also make note of is that, as we were preparing this information, we found that we had a lot of information. And so that was kind of a driver to make us decide to make this part one of a two-part series where we're going to be covering some of these commonalities and the potential gotchas. So with that, we'll move on.
Well, and actually, if I can add, so today we're going to be going up through the CIP V5 standard, and then part two is going to go from CIP 6 through CIP 11.
Yes, thank you. All right. So what's still required? We still have to have our policies, and they need to address everything. And the potential gotcha here is that, some things are overlooked. I mean, aren't policies kind of easy to do?
Yeah, so I mean, in the broad scheme of things, you're right, Lenny, in that, when you evaluate the more complex compliance requirements that need to be addressed, so for example, CIP 005, CIP 007, CIP 6, aspects of CIP 4, in the broad scheme of things, cybersecurity policies, is among the easier things to address. However, what we found is, we all know the devil's in the detail, and when you look at version 3 specifically, it says, hey, you want to make sure that your cybersecurity policies address all the standards and the compliance requirements. And what we find is, first of all, it's very unusual that a utility, and by the way, when I say utility, I'm encompassing electric generation, transmission utilities, as well as co-ops and municipals, but rather than saying that all over and over again, I'm just going to say utilities are responsible entities moving forward. But at any rate, with that said, it's very unusual that we see a utility operating in the absence of cybersecurity policies. However, what is rather common is when we look through cybersecurity policies and we correlate them to each standard and compliance requirement, there may be some compliance requirements and cybersecurity considerations within the standards that are overlooked or the cybersecurity policies fall silent on. And, from our experience, we believe that, it's just a matter of when utilities are immersed in preparing the cybersecurity policies and juggling that with all the other things that need to be done for NERC CIP compliance, as well as everybody's, responsibilities in a utility, for whatever reason, some compliance requirements, some cybersecurity considerations get overlooked. And the big thing here is, when you're focusing on these cybersecurity policies, and especially when we look towards version 5, just make sure all bases are covered. Make sure that you have subject matter in your cybersecurity policy that sufficiently addresses the subject matter in question.
Yeah. Just to add to that, I was being a little bit facetious when I said, hey, policies are easy, right? I mean, on the surface, it would seem like a pretty academic exercise. You write it down and you put it away and no one ever sees it again and all of that. But really, it is a challenging thing to do. In some cases, it's hard to tell the difference between a policy and a procedure. Or sometimes we write policy statements and call them procedures. So the devil in the details, as you said, when we go line by line for each specific thing that you're supposed to say something about, that's when we can can find some blank spots and things that maybe have been left out. So on to our next topic. It's still required to identify your senior manager, and you've got to document the change in senior manager. Potential gotchas. Maybe there's more than one person, or it's not documented in a timely fashion. Like that also sounds kind of simple. What kind of problems do we see in this thing that might seem simple?
Yeah, so, there's a lot of things that need to be addressed for CIP compliance. And, it's natural where you might be focusing so heavily on the more complex, more onerous aspects of compliance that the less complex ones, may get overlooked. And, from our experience, this is an example of that, where it's straightforward. We've seen on occasion that more than one individual is assigned that CIP senior manager role, whereas in version 3 it specifically states, that single person who's ultimately accountable for the compliance program. But, more aligned to what I was saying in terms of, again, some of the more simple aspects getting neglected is, everybody's doing their day job. And then on top of that, they have certain NERC CIP compliance responsibilities for those that aren't full-time dedicated to that effort. And, changes happen, turnover occurs, and as it pertains specifically to senior managers, whether it's due to turnover, changes in roles and responsibilities, those changes are executed. And, we've seen a trend where that change occurs, but then that change isn't applied to what needs to be documented in terms of the designated CIP senior manager within the required time frame. So, to your point, Lenny, in the broad scheme of things, a very simple administrative task, but, while being immersed in all the other more complex aspects of compliance, this is one thing that, we've seen get overlooked.
Yeah, and one aspect of the gotcha here where, maybe things don't get documented in a timely fashion. A lot of times, it's thought about like, yeah, I need to remember to do that, and, sometimes it doesn't get remembered. And I would submit the best way to think about it is I need to make sure I can prove that, and that need to prove that we documented it, and this was the date that the change took place, and this was the date we did the documentation, and timestamp it and put it in the evidence locker, and then you can prove it. So just in terms of documenting that timely change, it's about being able to prove it. Right? So another thing that's still required between, CIP version 3 and CIP version 5 is that we need to sufficiently document the delegations. Delegations are still in the game, and what are some problems that we've seen about that?
Yeah, so this is something that we very commonly encounter in the context of version 3, where let's say we're doing a compliance audit and we're reviewing various documentation and we're looking at the evidence and we see attestations. And when we review the attestations, we see people's signatures. And the signatures are by people with names that aren't the same name as the designated senior manager. So it becomes obvious that as it pertains to these attestations and other contributions we see from people as it pertains to the compliance program documentation and evidence artifacts, these people are not the senior manager. They're obviously people that are delegated certain NERC CIP compliance management roles and responsibilities. However, a lot of times a formal designation of those delegates are not officially documented. as is specifically required in that CIP 3, version 3, or 2.3 compliance requirement. It's a very common situation. Again, it lends very much towards just being so involved in the day-to-day operations of the NERC CIP compliance management process that the finer details associated with some of these administrative tasks get overlooked. And, you know, this is very prevalent, very common, and, you know, that's essentially the issue is you see all these different people popping up when you review the compliance program documentation, the evidence artifacts that haven't been officially documented, designated as senior manager delegates.
Yes. So sometimes you see that somebody has approved something and you're wondering, hey, who are they? They're not officially delegated responsibility. You know, how is it that this works?
Exactly. And, you know, in the broad scheme of things, no one in their right mind would ever expect that the senior manager, that one person, you know, would be in the trenches doing everything that's required to, you know, execute and maintain a compliance program. So obviously, you know, everyone's eyes are to understand who are the delegates, and you just want to make sure that they're documented as specifically required.
That's great. So coming up now on to one of my favorite topics, security awareness, and that's still required. So what are some of the challenges that we've seen with respect to security awareness?
So with security awareness, this is where the compliance period that's being evaluated. So let's say the regional entity auditor comes in and he says, hey, I want to see things as it pertains to the compliance period of October 1, 2010, the present day. And when they evaluate that compliance period, and then more specifically, they're looking at this first requirement in CIP 4, version 3, they're going to want to see that you are administering required security awareness on a quarterly basis throughout the compliance period. And I'm focusing on the compliance period, but in reality, you need to be generating and disseminating security awareness content on a calendar quarterly basis in perpetuity, indefinitely. But what we find is when that certain compliance period is being evaluated, some quarters will be covered in that we can tie specific security awareness content to certain calendar quarters, but then we also find commonly that there's no security awareness content that's been prepared and disseminated for, you know, other calendar quarters in the compliance period that's being evaluated. So the big gotcha there is, you know, you can have the peace of mind knowing that you have a security awareness program in place and that security awareness content is being developed on a recurring basis and disseminated accordingly. But it's somewhat common where holistically when you're looking at a certain period of time, some calendar quarters are overlooked.
Yeah, that's right. And I'd like to also focus in on the word administer. You know, administering a program entails, or I should say suggests that, like, you've got it all together. You know that all the people who need to receive the content are receiving the content. You know, you're memorializing, you know, the dissemination of that content and all of that. Like, you could say a well-managed process where, you know, everything that needs to be covered is getting covered.
Absolutely. It's a great point. And, you know, to successfully administer a security awareness program, part of that responsibility is to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. So more specifically, that you are covering every calendar quarter moving forward.
Yeah. Another kind of point about security awareness that bears mentioning is this. It doesn't all have to be, you know, industrial control system related security awareness, you know, topics. General security awareness, you know, information security awareness are great topics. The purpose of this, you know, the reason, one of the reasons why this is a requirement in NERC CIP is that by having a successful information security awareness program, what you do is you raise the information security awareness of, you know, your constituency. And I liken information security awareness to like street smarts. You know, call it cyber street smarts. That some of you may have heard this analogy before, but if you're walking down the street and some shady individual from a dark corner says, "Hey, buddy, you know, hey, come over here. You know, you've got some street smarts," and you know that you don't want to associate with that individual. And so cyber street smarts, you know, what that might look like is you get that email and it has a link, and you don't know who it's from or why you got it. And then that red flag goes off in your mind, and you say, I remember back in security awareness training, they were talking about people might try to trick you and might try to get you to click on a link that goes somewhere bad and does something bad. And that, you know, I don't know the details of how it works, but I remember that part. I'm going to not click on this link. And that's a win. That's a touchdown in security awareness land.
Yeah, and in addition to street smarts, it's very much related to behavior. So, you know, a lot of times building and reinforcing security awareness is about the utility conveying what it believes is appropriate behavior. So, you know, not clicking on attachments that are included in emails from people that you don't know. There's definitely an element of street smarts, but that's also an aspect of cybersecurity behavior. So a lot of times utilities will align their security awareness messages towards certain behaviors that they want to see conducted or performed within their environment. You know, another example is piggybacking. So if you're going into a restricted area, say like a PSP, you know, make sure that someone behind you doesn't run right on in without having to say, you know, scan their badge or use whatever is required to gain that access into the PSP. So reinforcing sound cybersecurity behavior is also a very strong emphasis of security awareness.
That's right. And just another thing that comes to mind, security awareness is often, you know, one aspect of information security in general that, you know, sometimes people think about it as like secondary and kind of maybe not that important. And and the thing is, this is not true at all. Security awareness is a culture changer. It can actually change the culture. In a company or, you know, a group or whatever kind of entity you're talking about. And when you think about that, that's a lot of power. You know, it's not an overnight culture changer, but it is a culture changer. So, yay, awareness. Okay. Next thing that's still required is we have the topic of cybersecurity training. You know, the training topics are identified in the standard itself. So, you know, where's the problem here?
So the gotchas, the deficiencies that we've seen on occasion, it pertains to a very trite expression. So you have the expression, okay, you've got John Doe, and John Doe is the guy who created this particular procedure in our utility. And what happens if John Doe gets hit by a bus or becomes gravely ill and he's not available for an extended period of time? Is there someone else in our organization that can take over ownership of whatever aspect of the NERC CIP compliance program that John Doe was, you know, managing himself? And when you look at cybersecurity training content, a lot of times it very topically addresses the subject matter that's specifically identified in that version 3 CIP V5 R2.2 requirement. And when you evaluate the content, we've seen a lot of instances where if you were reviewing it from the mindset of, okay, I am entirely new to this particular subject matter, say this particular procedure, can I really glean from the training content exactly what's required so that I could perform the activities necessary to ensure that the utility remains compliant with this compliance requirement should John Doe, that lead guy, not be available for whatever reason. And there is a trend where when you look at things from that perspective, there isn't a sufficient level of prescriptive guidance in terms of how is that procedure to be executed. But then above and beyond that, it's unusual for training programs to be oriented towards certain roles and responsibilities that personnel fulfill in the context of a NERC CIP compliance program. So for example, would a person in human resources need to understand the inner workings of a cybersecurity incident response process or program? Probably not. However, would a human resources person need to understand, say, the inner workings of how personnel risk assessments are administered and how they need to be administered and completed prior to granting access to critical cyber assets? Yes. So, a lot of times we'll see a one-size-fits-all set of training content where it doesn't take into account certain roles and responsibilities, and it doesn't tailor specific content to those roles and responsibilities. And these are all things that lend towards, again, a trend that we've seen where the training content itself, it just doesn't sufficiently address the subject matter identified specifically in that version 3 CIP V5 R2.2 requirement. And then when you go to version 5, the subject matter is expanded a bit, so it makes what is already somewhat challenging even more onerous from a cybersecurity training perspective. So it's just something to be cognizant of, for sure.
All right, so if we're going to be really doing a good job at this, then it makes sense for us to have different roles for our training, like you were saying, the HR representative versus the computer security incident response team members. What are let's see some other kind of roles, system engineers or an operator, maybe even a senior manager or a particular person delegated by that senior manager. Really, it's kind of about the roles. And before we go further, can you tell us a little bit about the difference between security awareness training and between awareness and training?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we were saying earlier, security awareness, it focuses on reinforcing what you, the utility, considers to be good practice, best practice, acceptable practice, whatever it is that you may be championing within your utility. It's reinforcing sound practices. It's conveying what you consider to be appropriate, acceptable cybersecurity behavior. And it tends to be communicated in amounts that are that can be easily processed by the people consuming that security awareness content. When you go to training, training focuses on instilling a certain set of competencies that you want the audience to process, to learn, and then apply in the future. So, training tends to be very prescriptive in nature, very detailed, not by any stretch of the imagination topical. And again, it focuses on instilling certain competencies that you want that audience to attain and then possess and apply moving forward. So whereas security awareness could be a poster, a simple email, something that shows up in a memo or on the intranet site, training is something that, either administered over the web or in a classroom setting, typically requires, hours, if not days of time, very rigorous, very extensive. Hey, Lenny, did we lose you?
I'm sorry, I had cleared my throat earlier and I muted the phone. Thank you. So to shed a little bit more light on this, I'd like to just make a few quick examples of a few different roles and perhaps what the training content might look like for those roles. So let's take our HR representative. Steve was, as he said earlier, that person would really need to know how to perform the inner workings of personnel risk assessment, process. And that would kind of be what their training, would look like, or an hour of it, or whatever. But just as one example of a subject matter that might be covered there, how to perform and appropriately document, memorialize, and make your evidence, all of that. So the next role that we were talking about would be, let's say, a DCS engineer, or somebody who is responsible for supporting your SCADA servers, or something along those lines. This person, maybe some of their training would be how to perform the ongoing management of our ports and services justifications. So how to collect the data and how to, from the computers, to see what they're running, and then how to try to match that up with our written justifications that we already have. So like how to really perform that process. And then as the third example, let's say a member of the computer security incident response team. This type of role would probably be receiving like information security training, perhaps forensic training, the type of things that would help a first responder like this figure out what's going on. How do I put a stop to it and mitigate? Where do I go from here? How do we determine if they did get in, or what have you? So these are all some examples of some very different and very specific subject matter that would be appropriate for these three sample roles. All right. So our next topic, administer cybersecurity training and granting that access, whether it be the physical or the cyber access. So what exactly are we talking about here in terms of consistency breakdown?
Yes, this is something that is very prevalent. Typically when we're conducting an audit or we're providing some sort of assistance around remediation as it pertains to these noted compliance requirements, we'll see a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, typically. Not always, but it's pretty common. And in that spreadsheet, it'll have the names of each individual that has been granted either cyber or authorized unescorted physical access to critical cyber assets. And it'll indicate the date at which cybersecurity training was most recently completed. It'll indicate when the personnel risk assessment was completed. And it will indicate the date at which that access in question was first granted. and you look at that Excel spreadsheet in isolation, it looks fantastic, it's convincing, and you get the impression that yes, as it pertains to the version 3, CIP 4, R2, and R3 compliance requirements, everything looks good, everything looks compliant. Now, when you dig further into the evidence and you start looking at logs, so for example, physical access control system logs for the PSPs, and you review via time and date stamps when particular individuals entered and exited certain PSPs, or when you review logs of successful login attempts that were made by various individuals gaining cyber access to various critical cyber assets or non-critical cyber assets and ESPs. When you correlate what you see in those logs to what you see in the Excel spreadsheet, you start seeing some inconsistencies where, for example, John Doe engaged in cyber access with a particular critical cyber asset with a certain host name. Let's say that John Doe engaged in that access in December of 2013. And then you review the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, and it indicates that access actually wasn't granted until January of 2014. Or you might see that Jane Doe gained access to PSP ABC in June of 2013, yet in the spreadsheet, Jane Doe didn't complete the training until August of 2013. So, you know, this is a very common trend that we've seen where when you dig down into that added level of evidence, you start seeing a little bit of consistency breakdown between those logs and, you know, what's indicated in those consolidated Microsoft Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and it is something that we see, you know, commonly. Not only, you know, with respect to this, I mean, in ports and services and whatnot. You know, sometimes we'll see a wonderful looking spreadsheet, you know, pertaining to services, and you know, just looking at it, and it looks great. And then we pull the config from the box, and we see what services are actually there and how they're configured. And then maybe the spreadsheet looks a little bit less good after that, you know, after identifying things that aren't there or things that are there in the spreadsheet that we don't find in the running configs and other kind of inconsistencies. Yeah. What your spreadsheet says needs to match up with whatever you're talking about in the spreadsheet, really. All right. So personnel risk assessment still required. Not a big surprise there. What are some of the gotchas here, Steve?
In this situation, what we commonly find is background checks are consistently performed. So as it pertains to background checks, and as it pertains specifically to this R3.3 compliance requirement, it's that identity verification, and it's a criminal check. However, it's very common for things to stop there, where that background check was conducted, but the assessment, the risk assessment, you know, was not conducted. And what's meant by the risk assessment is, okay, you've done your identity verification and you've done your criminal check. Now, what is your criteria in terms of whether or not you're going to proceed in granting this particular individual that physical or cyber access to those critical cyber assets? What's your go, no-go criteria? And then further, it's not just a matter of identifying what that go, no-go criteria is, but then you have to apply that criteria to each and every individual based upon the identity verification and criminal check results that are obtained. And, you know, it's common from what we've encountered where utilities will just do the background check, but then they don't conduct this risk assessment that's required. And that risk assessment, again, should consist of whatever that acceptance/rejection criteria is, and there should be documentation that demonstrates the application of that criteria to each individual in question, and then ultimately documents the go, no-go determination. And, you know, just as you indicated, Lenny, personnel risk assessments aren't going away in version 5. So this is a very common shortcoming that we've encountered that, you know, definitely is going to need to be sufficiently addressed moving forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right,
All
so
right.
we're in slide 12, and now it's my turn to turn the table on you, Lenny. You've been asking me all these questions, so I want to have an opportunity to put you under the fire, if you will, a little bit. And we're
all right, go easy on me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So we're talking. Hey, Lenny, you still there?
Yes, I am. I lost you for a moment as well, but I hear you now.
Okay, good deal. So this is pertaining to the electronic access privileges. Now, we're talking about version 5, but this is relevant also to version 3. But we're talking about making sure that these electronic access privileges to, again, we're talking about high and medium impact BES cyber systems, and then their associated cyber assets. Hey, Lenny, we got to, okay. So, you know, when I review the potential gotcha here that's noted, I was just hoping that you could maybe expand upon that a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the drivers here, one of the causes for, let's say, common problems in this regard is that this is really hard to do. We're talking about, on a quarterly basis, being able to evaluate everybody who has permissions somewhere in our NERC CIP environment. And so we're talking about operating systems there. We're talking about permissions assigned within a given application, maybe. So this can be pretty challenging to actually get that all written down. And it's actually not even just about writing it down. You know, you need to think about how this is going to happen on a recurring basis. We need to do this 4 times a year. So on a recurring basis, we need to be able to gather data from our computers and our other cyber assets that say, you know, what are all the accounts on here? What are all the various levels of permissions? To whom have these permissions been assigned? Okay, that's the operating system. Now we see that we're running, you know, the VCS application or EMS application, what have you, and what different permissions exist in there, and to whom have they been assigned. And so you kind of expand that out to all of your cyber assets that are covered under NERC CIP, and you know, you begin to get a bit of a can of worms there in terms of the logistics. How are you going to do it? Are you going to walk around and take screenshots and so forth? So the process of gathering that data in a way that's, you know, repeatable, sufficient, safe, and easy, and then the process of comparing that, you know, what are the permissions that exist in the running configs from the devices, and then how does that compare up to what I have documented in terms of what people are supposed to have. And it's the results of that comparison that you want to be able to memorialize. You know, so getting that data in the first place is a very challenging and onerous thing. Just like getting the data for anything in terms of NERC CIP when we're talking about evaluating the configs and so forth, the technical aspects. We need to measure the running configs, you know, in most cases. So that's one of the big things. It's not going away, and it's still a primary challenge to make sure that you can get that data and then put it through a process showing that you compared it to what it was supposed to be.
Yeah, and actually, this is similar also to what we were talking about, security awareness content being reinforced, distributed, prepared on a quarterly basis. So, you know, another thing that we've seen is maybe some calendar quarters, a utility can demonstrate that these checks were conducted, but then in the context of that compliance period, you know, there's times where other calendar quarters are overlooked. It's an incredibly onerous process, and you know, for reasons that we mentioned earlier, it's very easy to have things humming along and have certain calendar quarters covered, and then, you know, just in the context of doing things in perpetuity, you know, some things may not be executed in other calendar quarters.
Yeah. That's right. So this next slide, we're talking about access privileges to protected information. And that is still required, that information to, pardon me, access to information about protected cyber assets is still something that needs to be closely regulated. Can you tell us about some gotchas here?
Well, you know what, it's really the same as what we just discussed regarding that electronic access to the cyber assets, except, you know, the emphasis here is on the information. And, you know, the same challenges that we discussed around electronic access privileges apply here. You know, sometimes certain calendar quarters are covered, others, you know, for whatever reason are overlooked. And then also, you know, just that challenging endeavor of, one, making sure that you're keeping track of the access privileges that have been granted to each person who, you know, can access this information in question, and making sure that you're reviewing it on a recurring basis. Very same considerations as for electronic access. It's just that this applies specifically to that protected information.
Yeah, a lot of these things are the kind of problems a reminder would be very helpful for. So our next topic here, it's still required for us to you know, remove access when it's for cause, and do it within 24 hours. Make sure that we can do that and prove that we've done it. What are some gotchas here?
Yeah, so when we refer to version 3, there's different thresholds of time frames, windows within which access needs to be revoked, 7 days, 24 hours, etc. And, you know, one challenge that utilities have encountered is making sure that when it's deemed necessary to revoke the access in question, so whether it's that cyber access to critical cyber assets or the authorized unescorted physical access to the critical cyber assets, you know, there have been challenges to ensure that access has been revoked within, you know, the time frame required. There have also been instances where, when we start dissecting the access logs, we'll find that, you know, maybe someone was terminated, or maybe their responsibilities changed within the organization, and therefore it was deemed that that individual didn't require that access in question. But then when we look at the access logs, we find that either that individual has engaged in some form of access since the point in time at which that access was supposed to be revoked, or we just can't find any concrete evidence that demonstrates that the access in question was revoked for the particular individual that is being evaluated. And similar to what you said, Lenny, about electronic access and reviewing it on that periodic recurring calendar quarterly basis and how onerous it is, revoking access is not it's not a trivial thing if you're operating in the presence of a very expansive infrastructure environment and you have a lot of cyber assets that are in your compliance program. It's very easy, since a lot of times you have to revoke that access on a one-off per cyber asset basis. It's easy to revoke access for some and just maybe lose sight of other cyber assets to which the individual in question has access. So these are all challenges that utilities have been facing as it pertains specifically to these compliance requirements.
It really makes sense to have this process nailed down, so when you need to execute it, under rather tight time constraints, and you're going to need to prove that you were successful in doing so, kind of maybe even drills or some type of practice wouldn't hurt. Often, when the word goes out that access needs to be revoked, particularly on the double, there might be 4, 5, 6, 8 people in the loop on that, different administrators of systems, the Active Directory, the EMS, so on and so forth. So yeah, and again, always being able to prove it, sort of. I think about it like dropping breadcrumbs wherever you go. If you're doing something for NERC CIP, you need to be dropping some breadcrumbs. Those breadcrumbs are the things that you put in the evidence locker, memorializing the actions that were taken. On our next topic, still required, ESPs, our old friends ESP. And then with respect to our external routable connectivity, we need to go through access points. And so here we talk a little bit more about consistency breakdown. And could you shed a little more light on that, please?
Yeah, so this is it's similar in consideration to what we were talking about in terms of access management and the personnel risk assessments and the training and such. Totally different area of focus. And this is talking about what are the various critical and non-critical cyber assets in the scope of your compliance program. And what do things look like in terms of your inventory? So a lot of times utilities will have the host names, maybe even MAC addresses, IP addresses, and other attributes associated with each cyber asset, critical and non-critical, as well as your ESP access point devices, et cetera, that are in the scope of the compliance program in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And then commonly they'll have network drawings, and the network drawings will depict the manner in which these various cyber assets are interconnected and what the architecture looks like, et cetera. And then, there's also this added consideration of engaging in visual inspection. And something that we commonly encounter is when we're doing a compliance audit, or maybe we're doing a cyber vulnerability assessment, or whatever it is that we might be doing. When we go to evaluate consistency between the inventory in that Excel spreadsheet, let's say, what's depicted in the network drawings, and then what actually exists in the PSPs, a lot of times we'll find inconsistencies. We may see some cyber assets that for whatever reason were completely overlooked, not accounted for in the inventory in the Excel spreadsheet, but they were depicted in the network drawing. We might find that while in the network drawing there might be an ESP access point firewall that has 4 ports that are used, we might see on visual inspection that 6 are used. And then when we trace those cables, we might find some cyber assets that for whatever reason weren't accounted for, or that, at a minimum, their connectivity within the network environment within the ESP was not accurately represented. So, that's what we're talking about in terms of the consistency breakdown that we commonly encounter.
That's an excellent point. Ideally, we want to see a one-to-one-to-one relationship. You might have heard that before, between the inventory, the drawings, and what it is that can be observed in physical reality. And yeah, if something's missing or in the drawing, it shows that this firewall has 4 network cables, but in reality, it actually has 7 network cables. Those are things that make you go, if you're an auditor. All right.
All right, so now we're into slide 16. I'm going to put you into the fire here again, and we're talking about version 3, CIP V, R2.1, R2.2 compliance requirements. It's talking about inbound and outbound access permissions, as well as why you're granting that access and then making sure you're denying all other access by default. And I noticed further in the slide, it indicates that business justifications are required for those ESP access point rules, as well as the access control lists and ports and services. And when you look at the version 3 standard, those compliance requirements, nothing in there specifically says, hey, you need business justification. So are these business justifications really required, and what exactly are these business justifications?
All right, so great questions there. In terms of, let's go to the justifications first. In version 3, it doesn't use that word, and it's kind of something that Encari started using because it really gets to the point of the matter. And the point of the matter is this: we're only allowed to be using ports and services that are required. And with respect to ports, and talking about ESP access points, let's say, firewalls, there's 2 kind of ports at play here. Number 1 are the ports that terminate directly on the host itself, like the firewall. So the firewall might be listening on port 22, waiting for a firewall administrator to connect to it remotely and do their work. So those type of ports and the services that are running them in the background, those still require justification now. And in fact, it gets more specific about it in version 5. So the second kind of port are the type that are associated with a firewall passing traffic, so firewall rules, basically. And those also, we're required to have that deny by default. And we need to be documenting why these rules are necessary. To speak for a moment about deny by default now, kind of the second part, deny by default with respect to network traffic means I know all the things that I need to pass, all the traffic I need to go in and out or whatever direction between interfaces on the firewall. And so I have rules that are constructed to allow those things that I need. And then I've defined all that. And then the last rule is going to say drop everything else and log it. We need to be logging all of our traffic, whether it's accepted or dropped or passed, by the way. But one of the things we see, is a rule-based, roughly constructed like that. But then we start looking at the rules, and it says like, any source to any destination is allowed to send any type of ICMP packet. And then, a lot of times we start seeing that word any in a firewall rule, and we think, is that really true that anybody needs to be able to send ICMP, any kind of ICMP? It's probably true that a few, source and destinations and a few types of ICMP allowing that type of network traffic are required. But when we start to see things like any, that raises the question of, is this an overly permissive rule? And if it is, then you're not doing deny by default. You're allowing more stuff through than what you actually need. And this is still like a very sort of common thing that we see. A lot of entities are getting better and better with this, but writing a justification that says what this does and why we need it. And that goes for a firewall rule that's passing traffic, let's say at an ESP access point. That goes for that firewall itself, listening for the network administrator to connect to it. And that goes for any other type of ESP access points we might have other than a firewall, perhaps a router or a proxy server or something along those lines.
Okay, great. I think we should move on because we're just about right at 11:30 Central here.
Yeah. So with that, we're at the end of our content for today. As we indicated earlier, we have a lot more to talk about, kind of in this context of what are some of the commonalities between version 3 and version 5, and let's not forget the things that we need to be doing well today. As always, we want to reach out to our constituency. You really are the people who are driving this process and have helped us to enjoy the success we have with this, and your input is vitally important to us. So if there are things that you would like to hear spoken about, maybe some aspects we didn't cover today, please send us an email. There's still time to use the question interface in GoToWebinar. And Steve, did you have any closing thoughts?
Webinars is, just because there are a lot of profound changes that are coming with version 5, there's also a lot of overlap between version 3 and version 5. And whatever challenges you may be encountering as it pertains to those overlapping compliance requirements, make sure you get your ducks in a row for version 3 now, because you might be having many more cyber assets that are going to be in the scope of your version 5 compliance program, and you just want to make sure that you're nailing things now, in the life of version 3, so that you're very ready and well poised for version 5.
Yeah, we could have called this this session "The Devil is in the Details," couldn't we?
Absolutely.
All right. So with that, I will thank everybody. This is Steve Hamburg and Lenny Mansell signing off. We look forward to seeing you all next month's webinar, the continuation of version 3 and version 5 similarities and gotchas.
Thanks, Lenny. Thanks, everybody.